Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here today. I'd like to introduce my son Nelson, who came with me today. Nelson retired from his job in Wisconsin and came home to run the ranch and take care of his aged mother. And I keep telling his brothers how lucky they are that they live so far away. Nelson has to do it all. Thank you, Nelson. Aldo Leopold was my uncle, my father Carl's brother, and his wife Estella was my mother's sister. My mother was Dolores. They were both Bergers. And as a young person, I was very fortunate to spend a lot of time in Madison with them. Their youngest daughter, Estella, was my age, a couple months older. She's the only surviving child of Aldo and Estella. And she lives in Seattle. She taught at the University of Washington for over 30 years. I just talked to her on the phone a couple days ago. We're very close because these cousins were double first cousins. Every time I went to Madison and spent any time, of course, every weekend we went to the shack. And it was such a wonderful place. Over the years, when they bought it, it was nothing. The house had burned down. The only thing left was a chicken house. And that's what they made into their shack. And there's a picture of the shack here. And they added on a little lean-to where there were 2 sets of bunk beds. And
no, I think it's the one, it's the framed one. Yeah, she didn't recognize it.
we always went up on a Friday after Uncle Aldo got home from his teaching job at the university, and we spent Saturday and Sunday there and came back. And on the way, we stopped at Baraboo and got a 20-pound chunk of ice, which Uncle Aldo put on the bumper, and we went a few miles to the shack, and he had made an ice box, which was a wooden box that had a border of sawdust, and that kept the things cool over the weekend. And we ate all our meals outside, unless it was raining, cooked over the open fire in a skillet or a Dutch oven. One day when we were driving to the shack, Estella and I in the back seat were bouncing around playing some silly game. It was before the days of seat belts. And Uncle Aldo was a very quiet man. He was not boisterous. He was not loud. But he got his message across. And he didn't turn and say, "You girls, calm down, stop that." He turned to Aunt Estella and said, "Do they have to do that?" And Aunt Estella immediately got us playing some nice, quiet little game. But as a very young child, because he was quiet, I decided that he was thinking of something very important. And turns out I was right. He had, when we would get ready to go to the shack, he didn't come in and say, "Come on, everybody, get going, hurry up." He would take the clippers and go out and start trimming the privet hedge that was along the front sidewalk. And when you looked out and saw Uncle Aldo trimming the privet hedge, you knew you better get ready to go, because he was ready to go. One time in their living room, there was a piano, and I was taking music lessons at the time, and I was fooling around on the piano. And he said to me, "Carol, would you play some songs for me?" And if I had been invited to play at Carnegie Hall, I couldn't have been more pleased. Well, I didn't have my music with me, but I had memorized a few songs. And I made some mistakes, but I played my repertoire. And afterwards he said, "That's very nice, Carol. Thank you very much. Keep on practicing." He was very subtle. When we went to the shack, I was never there when they were planting trees, because I think they did that early in the spring. But over the years, that family planted over 40,000 trees.
Whoa.
This property that they bought, there was nothing on it.
Jeez.
The man who had owned it lost it, and I think Uncle Aldo got it by paying the taxes on it, because there were taxes due on it. But it was a secluded place where it was like you had the world all to yourself. It was a wonderful place. Aldo married into a very interesting family. His mother-in-law, Eloisa Luna, lived in New Mexico with her family. The Lunas, the first Luna came over from Spain 28 years after Columbus with Cortez on Cortez's second trip. And it just proves it's not what you know, it's who you know. He was a cousin of Cortez's wife.
Wow.
And Cortez brought his wife on his second trip. And that's how the Luna got to come. But it's interesting how the Lunas got their name. In the 1400s, the Spanish were trying to drive the Moors out of Spain, trying to drive them back to Africa. And this young army officer named Bacala suggested to his superiors that they have launch an attack in the nighttime. All the attacks were launched at dawn because there was going to be a full moon, and he thought it might surprise the Moors. Well, it worked. It did surprise them. They drove them into the ocean, and that was a very successful battle. At least that battle was. And the king was so happy at this victory that he knighted Bacala, changed his name to Luna, which means moon, and gave him a coat of arms. So that's how the Lunas got their name. Isn't that interesting? Eloisa Luna, who turned out to be Aldo's mother-in-law, as a 13-year-old, as an 11-year-old, got on the stagecoach with her chaperone, went east to Kansas City, because that's as far as the railroad came at that time, and then by train to New York to a convent, and she spent 2 years and finished her education there. Came home, got married at 15 to Manuel Otero, and his family had a land grant from the King of Spain. I don't know if the King of Spain knew about it, but the Viceroy of Mexico did. And it was 500,000 acres. And in the meantime, what's the guy's name from Boston?
Whitney.
Oh, yeah. Can't think of his first name. Joel Whitney. Sorry. Joel Whitney and his brother from Boston. You've heard of the Whitney Museum. That's the family. Had bought what they thought were the land rights to a Spanish land grant. So Joel Whitney came out and said, okay, this is mine. I bought this. And the Oteros said, no, no, no. We haven't sold anything. And it was going to go to court. But Joel Whitney didn't want to wait. So he got a gang of men and went out to the headquarters, took over the ranch, and one of the men got on his horse and went into town and told Mr. Otero that the Whitneys had taken over the ranch headquarters at Estancia Springs. So Mr. Otero got his gang together and they went out to the headquarters, and then first they argued and then there was a shootout. And one man was shot 11 times and survived. Mr. Otero was shot once from 4 feet away by Joel Whitney and died. So my grandmother at age 19 was a widow with 2 children and a third on the way. And later she married my grandfather. But Nelson has gotten on the internet, and the history, the Office of New Mexico History has a lengthy article about this land grant. And according to that, it was abandoned by the Bacas because the Indians killed all the sheep herders and stole the sheep. But it's, according to what the historian has said, it's a little different in a couple places from what my family's story is. And you can imagine over the years how many times this story has been retold and retold and retold, and maybe a word added here and a couple words deleted there. So there, you can understand why there'd be a little difference of opinion. My family story is that Joel Whitney was arrested by the sheriff, taken to jail, and 3 days later, the sheriff put him on the train at midnight to go back to Boston. And the sheriff's wallet was bulging. And my family said he was never tried for the crime. But I've read a couple of different stories that say when the train got to Las Vegas, New Mexico, he was taken off the train and he was charged with the crime, but he was acquitted because they said it was self-defense. So, anyway, whatever turns you on. Aldo's family, his mother was the Clara Starker, and her father were Marie and Charles Starker, and they came over from Germany, and I heard, I don't know if this is true or not, that they met on the boat coming over from Germany. But Charles Starker was an architect, and he worked in Baltimore for a while, and then he went to Chicago and worked in an architect's office. And while he was there, Governor Grimes, who was the governor of the territory of Iowa before it was a state, went to Chicago to get an architect to come to Burlington and build a house for him, because Burlington was the capital of the territory of Iowa. That was before it was moved to Iowa City. And so Charles Starker came to Burlington and did that job, and he liked Burlington so much that he stayed. He said it reminded him of home. Burlington is like Rome. It was built on 7 hills, and that evidently that he liked that. And he did some more architectural work there, but there wasn't that much going on in Burlington at that time. So he went into the wholesale grocery business, and then he founded 2 banks. Why 2 banks? I don't know. So he was a very successful businessman in Burlington. And they bought a home up on the bluff just south of the railroad bridge. There wasn't a wagon bridge at that time. It was just the railroad bridge. And that home was built by a Burlington native who had been a high-ranking officer in the Civil War. And when the Civil War was over, he came home, back to Burlington, built this lovely mansion on the bluff, but he only stayed 1 or 2 years. I guess it wasn't exciting enough for him, and then he went to California because the gold rush was going on. So Charles Starker bought this home, and Aldo and his parents and his siblings lived with their grandparents. And eventually, when there got to be 4 of them, it was kind of a little much for Charles Starker to have all these kids around. So he built a house next door for Clara and Carl Leopold. But they hadn't lived in it very long. When he died, he was only 59. So they moved back into the big house because Marie was alone. I don't know if eventually Marie learned English. I know when the children were growing up, they spoke German at home, like the Amish. And of course, Charles Starker spoke very good English because he was in business. But Marie at that time didn't speak it. So my father learned English when he went to school. And years later, my mother and father went to Germany to visit my sister and her husband. My brother-in-law was a general in the army, and they were stationed in Germany. This is after the war. And when they went downtown to look around and do shopping, my father spoke German to the people in the stores, and everybody commented that he spoke without an accent because he had learned German before he learned English, and he was very proud of that. One thing I wanted to tell you about the Lunas, one more thing. I thought this is my favorite story. In 1852, my great-grandfather, Juan Antonio Luna, took 25,000 sheep and walked them from New Mexico to California because the gold rush was going on and the prices in California were much, much better. In west of Colorado, they lost 1,100 of them in a sand field
There you go.
because the little hooves were sinking in the sand and the sheep that kept coming behind them trampled the ones in front. So I don't know exactly how many they got there. And they said also Indians would come on horseback and cut off a half a dozen and drive them away. They didn't bother to chase them. But right outside of Los Angeles, they sold the sheep for $5.50 a piece. And back in New Mexico, they would have brought 50 cents a piece. So that was such a success that later they did it again. They never took that many. Altogether, they took over 40,000 sheep. And I think one time they got $10 a piece for them, which was a bonanza. But on that first trip, a year after they left New Mexico, they came home and they had $70,000 in gold coin and gold dust, which doesn't sound like a fortune in this day and age.
That's
But
true.
back then, it was like $1 million.
Yeah.
And that's what made them big wheels in New Mexico.
My.
I had an uncle, he was an Otero half-uncle, who ran for governor. Didn't make it, got close. I had an aunt, she was also an Otero, who ran for Congress. This was way back. Women didn't do that. She won the outlying districts, but she didn't, I think she lost by 199 votes, which was pretty close for back then. One of my favorite stories about the shack, and I wasn't there when this happened, but I love it. When they made the shack into their cabin, they built a fireplace inside, Uncle Aldo and the boys. And it never really drew very well. Sometimes if you were in there, it was not really smoky, but the smoke wasn't all going up the chimney. And 3 different times, Uncle Aldo added a couple layers of bricks to the chimney, thinking if the chimney is taller, it would draw better. Didn't work. Anyway, one time he was doing this. He was up on the ridge of the roof. He had a bucket and a trowel and mortar. And my cousin Carl was on the ladder handing him the bricks. And Estella, my cousin, was on the ground handing the bricks to Carl. So Uncle Aldo put one of the bricks on, and he turned and got another brick from Carl. And when he turned back, he bumped the brick that he had just put on, and it fell down into the chimney. And Estella saw this, and she called out, "Whoopsie!" And Uncle Aldo said, "Whoopsie, God damn it." And ever after that, whenever anybody dropped anything or tripped or anything unexpected happened, all you had to say was, "Whoopsie." Everybody knew what the next line was. And everybody laughed. So I think our family has more family stories than most. And another one, which is kind of sacrilegious, is about the Lunas. And this was their home in Santa Fe, the Bergers, I mean. And every morning after breakfast, the younger kids would gather on the front porch and decide what they were going to do that day. We were going to go down Burrow Alley, or they were going to go down to the plaza This house was only a half a block from the plaza. And after they decided, Uncle Joe was the youngest of all the children. And he was just 3 years old when the rest of them were this big. And so they decide what they were going to do. Everybody would jump up. One of the girls would pick up Uncle Joe and run after the others saying, "Wait for baby." Well, one day they were out there deciding what they were going to do, and they made up their minds. Everybody jumped up and ran off. Nobody picked up Uncle Joe. And he was like, as I say, 3 years old. And he ran after everybody, yelling, "Wait for baby, you sons of bitches." Terrible story. Oh, dear. Well, as I say, our family has a bunch of them. So whenever anybody is in a group in the family and somebody is falling behind, they always say, "Wait for baby."
Wait for baby.
And you don't have to say the next line because everybody knows what it is. Oh, there was something else I was going to tell you.
Talk about the shack.
My mind is a blank. When we went to visit Aunt Estella and Uncle Aldo, I mean, nowadays, driving to Madison, Wisconsin is no big deal. I mean, there's interstate and you can just whip right up there. But in the old days, the roads weren't like they are now. And if my father wasn't going, if my mother was driving, she never went over 35 miles an hour. So we would get up early and have breakfast. We never, ever stopped at a restaurant to eat. Mother always packed the lunch. And we got there just in time for supper.
Yeah.
And it was a long way.
Did you live here? Did you live down here then?
Pardon?
Was it down here or in Burlington?
What town?
Where did you live?
What town did you
We
drive?
lived in Burlington.
Burlington.
Okay.
And you
Yeah.
drive up, yeah.
My grandmother adored Uncle Aldo. It was her firstborn. And as I said, he probably learned many of his writing skills because he wrote home every week, sometimes more than once a week. In those days, you didn't get on the phone and call him unless somebody had died. But he, and so they came to Burlington fairly often because they were visiting not only Aldo's two brothers, but his mother. And she was very talented musically and even went to Heidelberg to study music at one time. When she was 13 years old, her parents, Charles and Marie Starker, took her and her brother Arthur to Germany because they still had relatives there. And while they were there, Charles Starker talked 300 German families, 1,500 people, into moving to Burlington, Iowa.
Whoa.
Now, what do you suppose he told them? The streets are paved in gold?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think the thing was, he told them that in America, you could own your own land, own your own home, and in Germany, and same way in Poland, the land was all owned by the royalty or the church. And so when whole families came that way, it wasn't like when Charles Starker came. He came by himself and left the rest of his family there. Burlington was a very German town. There was a German newspaper. And in the old days, you lived in the part of town where your parents or grandparents lived with the people who had come from the same country that they had come from. There was Hibernia, where the Irish lived. There was Dutchtown. And of course, I'm sure that was the way it was in lots of different places, but that went away a long time ago. Charles Starker, as an architect, designed the library. He was the chairman of the library committee. He designed the opera house. They tore the opera house down years ago to build the ugliest courthouse you've ever seen. Big mistake. He laid out Aspen Grove Cemetery. He laid out Crapple Park. Crapple Park was where Lewis and Clark crossed the Mississippi when they were on their trip. And they raised the United States flag on the bluff of Crapple Park, and it was the first place that the American flag had been raised west of the Mississippi. So that was interesting. But he went into other businesses because there weren't that many architectural jobs in Burlington. My father's father, Carl Leopold, was for a while a traveling salesman. Barbed wire had just been invented, and he sold barbed wire and roller skates. I mean, what a combination. And he would demonstrate the roller skates. And the young men in the towns where he went thought, oh, that looked wonderful. And so they would buy roller skates and go out and immediately fall down and go bang. But eventually, my grandmother, with 4 children, thought it would be nice if her husband was home more and not out on the road. So I think she suggested to my great-grandfather that maybe a business in town would be good for Carl. So they went together with the Rands, and they bought a furniture business. Was Rand Leopold at first, and then the Leopolds bought the Rands out, and it turned into Leopold Desk Company, which my father ran for years, and when he died, my uncle Frederick ran it, and then he sold it to Litton Industries, and they sent 2 men out from New York to run it, and they ran it in the ground in a couple of years. That was the end of that. An interesting thing about the Leopold desks, at one time they sent many desks to South Africa when the British owned South Africa. And I've often wondered, I wonder if there are any Leopold desks still left in South Africa. You know, they were roll tops at first, and then eventually they were just the other.
Thank you. You have so many stories.
You're right, I have a lot of stories.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. And I mean, we just want to thank you for all you've given us
Well,
today.
you're welcome. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
So
Can we
come
have
back.
some, can we have questions and answers? Can we have, yeah, questions?
Can you tell us about how you didn't know he was going to be famous when you were young, and when Aldo Leopold became more famous?
Well,
Here,
Just
come back
a-
to the microphone so they can hear you.
just the week before he died, his manuscript for the Sand County Almanac was accepted by the publishers. So he had written the book Game Management, but that wasn't something that everybody was going to be interested in. So he never knew how famous he was going to be.
That's sad. Did he feel some good feelings, though, about knowing the book was finally going to be published?
Oh, yes, he was very, very happy. Very happy about that.
And can you give us a little more talk about, you've been to the shack a few times, or several times? Can you tell us a little bit more detail about your remembrances of that, or any stories about that?
Well, the shack was just a wonderful place. I said, we only went in the shack when we wanted to get something or to go to bed. We were outside all
So
the
you
time.
camped? You camped?
Uncle Aldo got up very early every morning. I think he was sitting out on the bench by the big oak tree by 5 o'clock every morning, listening to the birds. He kept a record of when flowers bloomed and how early they bloomed. He kept that record for years, and after he died, his daughter Nina kept it, and I think it goes back 70 years.
Is it?
And it shows that everything is coming up earlier
And earlier.
blooming faster. So
Yeah,
it was long before global warming was talked about.
Did anyone else take up that habit in your family about, is it phrenology, or what's the word for
Phrenology, yes.
keeping accurate records of all the changes?
Well, it's, I don't know that.
It was just
how many
Estella
people are
that,
doing that,
but I mean, just the one daughter, Nina, took up that habit.
He was just
Not
doing
in-
it by himself. Okay.
Well, thank you so much.